My name is Caroline, but everyone calls me Carrie. I'm 27 years old, and today I want to share a story that still echoes in my mind, forcing me to return to those moments I so desperately wanted to forget. It happened 10 years ago, but I remember every glance, every word, every movement as if it were yesterday. At first glance, my life might have seemed ideal. I grew up in a small, cozy town in Wisconsin. Our family was a haven of love and harmony, at least on the surface. My father, James, owned a chain of auto repair shops and prided himself on providing us with everything we needed. My mother, Diana, ran the household with an ease I always considered almost magical. I had two older brothers, Evan and Lucas, the true stars of my childhood. They were my heroes, my protectors, my best friends. Evan was 21 at the time, serious and ambitious. Lucas was a year younger, and his easygoing nature always drew people in. If Evan was a rock-solid wall, Lucas was a sunbeam that warmed anyone in his orbit. We lived in a large house with a white porch and a garden full of roses that my mom cared for. It was a world where I felt completely safe. Looking back, I realized that safety was an illusion. But back then at 17 I was sure I had everything. Our evenings were spent as a family. Mom cooked dinner, Dad told stories about his adventures at work, and my brothers laughed and joked. We played board games, watched movies, and it felt like that happiness would last forever. My brothers were not just part of my world. They were its center. Evan often helped me with my homework, patiently explaining math, which never came easily to me. Lucas, on the other hand, was the master of entertainment. He always found a way to make me laugh, even on days when my mood was at its lowest. They were always there, protecting me from anything that might cause pain. Even at school, if someone dared to say something rude to me, my brothers would intervene, sometimes with sharp words, sometimes just with their presence. I remember one day when I was younger, one of my classmates, a boy named Johnny, thought it would be fun to knock over my lunch tray. I didn't cry, but I felt the humiliation tearing me apart from the inside. Evan and Lucas found out the next day. They didn't make a scene or fight. Instead, they just talked to Johnny, using words that seemed to carve icy patterns in the air. After that, the boy avoided me like the plague. These memories were my treasure. They created a warm cocoon where I could hide. But beneath that warmth there was another energy. Something I couldn't define then, but which made my heart beat faster whenever I was near Evan or Lucas. Their attention to me was always special, and although I couldn't understand it, I felt that their care went beyond ordinary sibling feelings. When I turned 17, I began to notice changes in our dynamics. These changes were subtle, barely perceptible, but significant enough to leave me confused. Evan and Lucas started paying even more attention to me. They asked how I was feeling, noticed the slightest changes in my mood. Their care began to scare me, but I convinced myself it was just their way of showing love. I remember one warm summer evening, sitting on the couch wrapped in a soft blanket. Lucas sat next to me, his hand on the back of the couch, almost touching my shoulders. Evan came later, sat on the other side, and handed me a cup of hot cocoa. We were watching some movie, and it felt like a moment I wanted to remember forever. But when a kissing scene started in the movie, the tension in the room became palpable. Lucas unconsciously gripped the edge of the pillow, and Evan looked at me as if he wanted to say something but remained silent. It was the first time I felt there was something more between the three of us, something I couldn't explain. My heart raced, but I couldn't understand what was making me so excited. That evening, I went to my room earlier than usual. Lying in bed, I tried to sort out my feelings. Why did I feel there was something more in those moments than just care? Why did it seem like our relationship was starting to change? I didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. Everything I thought was unchangeable was beginning to crack. Life continued as usual. Morning breakfasts with the smell of freshly brewed coffee, school days, family dinners. But I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was changing. These changes were imperceptible, like barely noticeable cracks in glass that become visible only under certain light. One Friday evening, when our parents went away for the weekend to celebrate their anniversary in Chicago, Evan suggested a movie marathon. It was our tradition, choosing old movies no one had seen and spending time on the couch with popcorn and laughter. Lucas supported the idea, and we decided to stay in the living room until late at night. We settled on the couch, me in the middle as usual, Evan to my left, Lucas to my right. The light in the room was dim, illuminated only by the soft glow of a table lamp. The first movie was funny but unremarkable, and I don't even remember its name. However, the second one, that movie was different. It was a romantic drama. I didn't pay attention to the description when Lucas chose it, but within a few minutes, it became clear it wouldn't be as light as the first. The plot revolved around two people who couldn't be together due to circumstances, but their attraction to each other was almost palpable. The further the movie went, the more I got drawn into its atmosphere. I noticed the atmosphere in the room had changed. Evan sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the screen, but I felt his hand on the armrest trembling slightly. Lucas, on the other hand, looked relaxed, but his breathing had become a bit deeper. I felt like I was between two streams of energy that touched but didn't cross. When a kissing scene started on the screen, I felt strange. My face flushed, and I tried to focus on the movie, but every nerve in my body was tense. I noticed Evan glanced at me, his gaze long and incomprehensible. Lucas chuckled softly, trying to ease the tension. "Carrie, are you even allowed to watch such scenes?" he said with a smile, slightly teasing me. His voice was playful, but I caught something else in it that made me feel even more uncomfortable. "I'm 17, Lucas, don't treat me like a child," I replied, trying to hide my embarrassment. But my words sounded uncertain, as if I didn't believe what I was saying. Evan, without taking his eyes off the screen, added, "She's right. It's time to stop treating her like a child." His voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it that made me uneasy. After that, I couldn't focus on the movie. All my attention was on what was happening around me. I tried to understand why Evan's words had such an effect on me. Maybe it was the way he said them, or maybe it was because they coincided with the moment in the movie where the characters started losing control over their feelings. When the movie ended, we went to our rooms. But I couldn't fall asleep. Lying in the darkness, I replayed everything that had happened that evening. Those moments, the glances, the words, the movements, seemed insignificant, but together they formed a picture that scared me. I felt something had changed between us, but I couldn't explain what. The next day, everything looked normal. Lucas and Evan acted as if nothing had happened, and I tried my best to hide my anxiety. But that anxiety only grew. Even the most ordinary moments began to seem strange to me. For example, Lucas, who always hugged me goodbye, now did it a bit longer. Or Evan, who spent more time at breakfast than usual just to talk to me. That evening, I stayed in my room trying to sort out my feelings. I wanted to go back to the time when everything was simple, when our relationship was free from the shadow of doubt. But that was impossible. I knew something had changed, and this something was growing like a crack in glass, ready to shatter into 1,000 pieces at any moment. After that evening, something inside me changed. I felt the thin line of trust between me and my brothers beginning to tremble. But I continued to tell myself that it was all my imagination, that I was overthinking insignificant things. After all, they were still my brothers, my protectors, those who always loved and cared for me. Could there be anything wrong with their attention? But these thoughts wouldn't let me go. Every time I was near Evan or Lucas, I caught myself thinking about them too much. For example, when Lucas touched my hand, it seemed longer than before. Or when Evan asked about my mood, his gaze was too deep, as if he was looking for something more than just an answer. One evening, when our parents were delayed at some event, the three of us were left alone at home. I was sitting on the living room floor, sorting photos for the school yearbook. Evan was on the couch with his laptop, and Lucas sat next to me, crossing his long legs in front of me to make me more comfortable. "Let me see what you're doing," Lucas said, leaning closer to me. His face was so close that I could feel his breath. My pulse quickened and I hurriedly moved away, pretending to look at one of the photos more closely. "They're just school pictures," I mumbled, feeling my cheeks flush. Lucas smiled, not noticing my embarrassment, and turned his gaze back to the TV screen. But I couldn't forget that moment. Evan looked up from his laptop and smiled at us. "Carrie, why are you so quiet today? Usually you talk non-stop." I just shook my head, trying to hide my feelings. But the way he said it made me feel like he knew more about my embarrassment than he let on. This made me even more nervous. The night went on. We decided to watch a movie as usual. I tried to relax, but the tension in the room was almost palpable. Lucas put his hand on the back of the couch behind my head, and Evan sat closer than usual. It wasn't anything unusual, but this time their gestures seemed to have a different subtext. When the movie ended, Lucas, stretching, suggested, "Maybe we should play cards or something. I don't want the evening to end so soon." Evan smirked. "You always want to win, Lucas. How do you plan to beat us this time?" "I just want to have a good time," Lucas replied with a smile, his gaze lingering on me for a moment. We decided to play a card game. I was focused on the rules, but every little thing, an accidental touch, fleeting glances, threw me off balance. At one point I looked up and noticed Evan looking at me. It wasn't the look I was used to seeing from him, not the look of a brother, but something else, heavier, almost studying. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly looked away. Later, when I went to my room, I felt uneasy. Everything felt wrong, but at the same time it excited me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that my feelings were deceiving me. But the thought that I might be right wouldn't let me go. I lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts were filled with images. Lucas with his accidental touches, Evan with his heavy gazes. These images made my heart race, and I couldn't decide what to do with this feeling. I wanted to talk to someone, but I didn't know who I could trust with this strange mix of emotions. The next day, I decided to keep my distance from them. I acted normally, but avoided unnecessary contact. This helped at least for a while. But Lucas and Evan noticed. They started asking questions, trying to bring me back into our usual circle of interaction. "Are you mad at us?" Lucas asked one morning at breakfast, his tone light, but his eyes filled with genuine concern. "No, of course not," I hurried to reply, feeling my defenses crumbling. "It's just a lot of schoolwork. If something's wrong, you'll tell us, right?" Evan asked, his voice soft, but his words made me tense. I nodded, unable to say more. Their care, which had always brought me comfort, now felt too intrusive, almost suffocating. But I couldn't tell them about it. How could I explain something I couldn't even understand myself? The evening was hot, and the air in the house seemed heavy, almost still. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through a magazine, but I couldn't concentrate. Every thought, every movement seemed permeated with the tension that was growing between me, Evan, and Lucas. I tried to pretend everything was normal, but with each passing day it became harder. When the clock struck 8, Evan came out of his room and headed to the living room. His gaze stopped on me and I felt my body tense. He sat on the couch across from me, folded his arms, and leaned forward slightly. "Carrie, can we talk?" His voice was quiet but insistent. I felt my throat go dry, but I still nodded. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He studied me for a few seconds before answering. "You've been distant. You don't talk to us like you used to. What's happening?" I didn't know what to say. My heart was in my throat, but I still tried to keep my voice steady. "You're right, I've been keeping my distance. But how can I explain why?" I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his eyes. "Are you mad at us?" he added, and there was a note of concern in his voice. "No, of course not," I replied, trying to convince not only him but also myself. At that moment, Lucas entered the room. His presence, as always, was light, but this time I felt he was watching our conversation closely. He sat next to me on the couch and leaned in slightly. "So what's going on, Carrie? You've been so quiet. Did we do something?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. I felt the pressure building. They both looked at me, their faces filled with genuine concern, but there was something too intense, almost all-consuming in their attention. My heart raced, and I realized I couldn't avoid answering any longer. "No, you didn't do anything," I said, finally looking up. "It's just everything, me, school, plans for the future. It all seems so complicated." It was half the truth, and I hoped they would believe it. Lucas smiled slightly, as if trying to lighten the mood. "You can tell us anything, Carrie. You know that," he said, his voice so soft that I wanted to believe him. Evan added, "We just want you to know, we're always here for you." After that conversation, I felt a bit lighter, although I knew the real reason for my behavior remained hidden. But that relief was short-lived. Soon, something happened that changed our relationship forever. The next evening, when our parents went out for dinner again, Lucas suggested we play a board game. We sat in the living room, and at first glance, everything seemed normal. We joked, laughed, and passed cards around. But I noticed the tension returning, as if it had always been there, just waiting. After a few rounds of the game, Lucas suddenly got up and headed to the kitchen, leaving me and Evan alone. I felt him look at me, his gaze long and heavy. "Are you really okay, Carrie?" he asked, and this time his voice was more serious. "Yes, Evan. Why do you keep asking?" I tried to brush it off. "Because I feel like you're hiding something," he said, moving closer. "We've always been honest with each other. Why are you silent now?" I felt his words touching something inside me, and the next second he placed his hand on mine. His touch was warm, comforting, but at the same time too personal. My heart raced. I opened my mouth to say something, but at that moment Lucas returned from the kitchen with a glass of water. He looked at us, and I quickly pulled my hand away, feeling the heat rush to my face. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice steady, but there was a flicker in his eyes that made me nervous. Later that evening, I went to my room earlier than usual, trying to collect myself. But my thoughts kept returning to what had happened. I couldn't understand what was going on between us. Why did their words, glances, and touches seem different? Why couldn't I shake this strange feeling? When I closed the door and lay in bed, I heard a knock. It was Evan. I knew it because he always knocks softly, as if he didn't want to disturb me. "Can I come in?" he asked, and I, hesitating, nodded. He entered the room and sat on the edge of the bed. His gaze was serious, but there was also a softness in it. "Carrie, I know you're feeling something. You can tell me." His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. I didn't know what to say. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid he could hear it. And then I said, "I'm just confused, Evan. I don't know what's happening to me." He nodded, as if understanding more than I expected. "We're confused too," he said. And there was something in his words that made me catch my breath. At that moment, I realized we had crossed an invisible line. The point of no return had been passed. Over the next few days, I tried to pretend nothing had changed. But every time I was alone with Evan or Lucas, the tension became almost unbearable. Even their silence seemed loud. I knew we all three felt it, but no one dared to say it out loud. One evening, when our parents were away again, Lucas suggested watching a movie in my room. It was a usual gesture. We often gathered in my room to spend time together. But this time I felt there was something more behind the suggestion. Evan came a little later, and we settled on the bed as usual. Lucas was to my right, Evan to my left. The movie was boring, and I noticed none of us were really following the plot. When the scene on the screen turned romantic, I felt Lucas lean in a bit closer to me. His hand accidentally brushed against mine, and I realized he didn't pull away. My heart pounded so loudly I was afraid they could hear it. "You look tense, Carrie," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. I nervously laughed, trying to change the subject. "The movie's just boring. Why did you even choose it?" Evan leaned in slightly. "Are you bored? Should we turn it off?" he asked, but his gaze was fixed on me, not the screen. I felt their closeness beginning to weigh on me. I wanted to get up, leave, find a way to escape this moment. But instead I stayed. Something inside me wouldn't let me move. A few minutes later, Lucas reached out to turn off the movie. The room fell silent. I felt their gazes focused on me, and the tension became almost unbearable. "Carrie," Lucas said softly, and there was something in his voice that made me shiver. "We've always cared about you. You know that, right?" "Yes, of course," I mumbled, not knowing where to put my hands or how to look them in the eyes. Evan added, "We want you to be happy. You understand that, right?" I nodded, feeling the words catch in my throat. Their voices, their closeness, their words. It all made me feel lost. I felt my world crumbling, but at the same time there was something alluring about it. At some point, Lucas placed his hand on my shoulder. His touch was warm, comforting, but also too personal. I looked at him and our eyes met. I saw something in his gaze I had never noticed before, and it filled me with a mix of fear and curiosity. Evan leaned in closer, his voice almost a whisper. "You can trust us, Carrie. We'll never hurt you." I wanted to respond, but the words disappeared. In the next moment, I felt Lucas gently brush his hand against my cheek. It was both tender and shocking. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I closed my eyes, trying to understand what to do. This moment felt both wrong and inevitable. We had crossed a line that I could no longer ignore. I completely surrendered to the feelings of my body and the energy that connected the three of us at that moment. Lucas began to take off my shirt while Evan took off my shorts. I did not resist as I desired it myself. Lucas kissed my lips and neck, while Evan kissed me down below. Everything from then on was like in a haze, in a sweet haze of pleasure and intense bodily sensations. Lucas and Evan kept switching places, first Lucas in front, then Evan behind, and then vice versa. We changed positions and methods of pleasure. This was the most pleasant bodily experience I had ever had. Later, when they left, I was alone in my room. I sat on the bed, feeling like the whole world around me had changed. It was too much. Everything that had happened seemed like a dream, something unreal. But it was reality. The three of us had crossed an invisible line, and now there was no going back. I knew I could no longer look at them the way I used to, but I also felt I couldn't push them away. Something had emerged between us that I couldn't understand, but it was too strong to ignore. The next morning, I woke up feeling like everything that had happened was just a bad dream. But when I got out of bed and looked at myself in the mirror, my reflection told the truth. My eyes were red and my face was pale. Everything that had happened the night before was real, and I knew it would stay with me forever. The whole day passed in a haze. I avoided Evan's and Lucas's gazes, but their presence was felt in every room. They also seemed quieter than usual, as if trying to comprehend what had happened. No one talked about it, but the silence between us was more eloquent than any words. During lunch, Lucas tried to bring the atmosphere back to normal. He told a joke, but his voice didn't sound as confident as usual. Evan tried to maintain the appearance of normality, but I felt he was also trying hard not to meet my gaze. I barely ate anything. Every spoonful felt heavy as lead. Everything inside me screamed that I needed to do something, say something, but I didn't know how. It felt like any word could shatter the fragile balance we were trying to maintain. That evening, I went to my room earlier than usual. I tried to distract myself, turned on the music, but even my favorite melodies felt empty. My heart was heavy as a stone. I thought about what had happened, about what we had done, and about how to live with it now. At some point, I heard a knock at the door. It was Evan. His presence was always calm, but this time I felt a nervousness in his figure. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. I nodded, unable to say anything. He came in, closed the door behind him, and sat on the edge of the bed. For a while we sat in silence, each of us seemingly afraid to speak. "I know you feel strange," he finally began, his voice careful. "I do too. We all do. But you should know, we never wanted to hurt you." His words were sincere, but they only made me feel heavier. I didn't know what to say. My heart was torn between fear, shame, and something I couldn't name. "I just don't know how to live with this now," I whispered, not looking at him. "I don't know what all this means." Evan reached out and gently took my hand. "It means we're confused. All three of us. But you're not alone, Carrie. We're together. We'll always be together." After his words, I felt a sense of relief but also fear. I knew he was right, we were bound, but now this bond had become too complicated, too heavy. I looked at him, trying to find answers in his eyes, but all I found was a reflection of my own confusion. When he left, I was alone with my thoughts. The whole world seemed shattered. Something inside me told me I needed to do something to put everything back in place, but I didn't know how. The next day, Lucas also tried to talk to me. He approached me in the kitchen while I was doing the dishes and stopped next to me. His voice was soft, but there was a worry in it. "Carrie, I don't want you to feel this way," he said, looking at me with sadness. "I don't want you to think this has ruined what we had." "Hasn't it?" I asked, turning to him. "Hasn't everything changed now?" Lucas sighed heavily. "Yes, it has changed. But that doesn't mean we've lost what we had. We're still a family. We still love you." His words were right, but they couldn't lift the burden I felt. I nodded, not knowing what else to say, and went to my room. These conversations left me in a state of uncertainty. I knew Evan and Lucas didn't want to hurt me, but what had happened had changed us all. I felt the chasm between us growing wider, despite their attempts to fill it with words. Over the following weeks, we tried to return to normal life. We talked about everyday things, laughed, watched movies, but it was all just a facade. Deep down, we knew we could no longer be the way we used to be. Looking back, I realized that moment was a turning point. We all crossed a line we should never have crossed. And although I know Evan and Lucas will always be there, I can no longer look at them the way I used to. This story has been a lesson for me. Boundaries exist for a reason. They protect us from destroying what we cherish. But sometimes, because of our emotions, we forget that. And the consequences of these mistakes can stay with us forever. Now, years later, I still think about those days. Sometimes I wish I could go back to a time when everything was simpler, when our relationships were pure. But I know the past can't be changed. All we can do is live with what we've done and try not to repeat those mistakes.